This presentation is an examination of the relationship between David Hume's Epistemology and Natural Theology for PHS 611, Logic and Epistemology. Looking at an overview of the presentation, I'll give a brief biography of David Hume, the main philosopher in question here. I'll look at an overview of his epistemology, and then consider why that epistemology is problematic for natural theology. By natural theology, I mean the attempt of our unaided human reason to attain knowledge of God. Then I'll offer some criticism of Hume's position and an alternative response to Hume's stance. Looking at the life of David Hume, the dates on him are 1711 to 1776. He was born in Edinburgh and attended Edinburgh University. And he was raised in a very religious environment, that of Scottish Calvinism, but he became opposed to organized religion at an early age, about age 23. He had a lifelong reputation as an atheist and skeptic, and interestingly enough, never had an academic position, which in large part was because of that reputation. And in addition to being a philosopher, he's known as a prominent stylist and historian. He's considered one of the most prominent English philosophers, and he's very influential to many thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, Adam Smith, Charles Darwin. How Hume's epistemology factors into natural theology. The short answer here is skepticism. And Hume is not an absolute skeptic. He does accept that we can know certain things. And he starts with accepting that the senses do give us certain information about the external world, which he refers to as matters of fact. In addition, he does accept mathematical sciences such as geometry. But even though he's not an absolute skeptic, he does severely limit the range of our reason. And two topics I'll discuss more that Hume limits our knowledge of include causality and induction. What are the foundations of Hume's epistemology? Hume is one of the empiricists, which means that he relies heavily on our sense experience of the world as the foundation of any knowledge we may have. And this quote illustrates that. He says, "It is experience only which gives authority to human testimony, and it is the same experience which assures us of the laws of nature." So like many modern philosophers, he wants to ground our knowledge on what is certain, and so the senses seem like a good place to start. And we can appreciate that in our scientific age. Then going through a couple other key concepts and terms for Hume, he talks about sense impressions and ideas. Like John Locke, he's very focused on ideas, and he considers ideas as copies of our original sense impressions. And he also identifies three principles of connection or association among the ideas, namely resemblance, contiguity in time or place, and cause and effect. And lastly, he has a distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact, so the realm of the mind versus the external world. Hume's account of causation is probably what he's most famous for, and this pertains to the realm of matters of fact. As we said before, there's a distinction between matters of fact and the world of the mind. So Hume says all reasonings concerning matter of fact seem to be found on the relation of cause and effect. By means of that relation alone, we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. So Hume's understanding of causality is that what we experience truly is temporal sequence rather than causal connection. We really just observe one thing following another, and we assume that the second thing was caused by the first. So this is a reductionistic understanding of causality. Hume's account, causality equals temporal sequence plus the custom we have of repeated experiences with the same results. So he writes, he would not by any reason be able to reach the idea of cause and effect, since the particular powers by which all natural operations are performed never appear to the senses. Nor is it reasonable to conclude, merely because one event in one instance proceeds from another, that therefore the one is the cause, the other the effect. Their conjunction may be arbitrary and casual. How does Hume understand induction? And the short answer is he rejects the possibility of induction, which in traditional philosophy is reasoning from particulars to a universal conception. So he falls in the class of nominalism, which considers the language that we use to describe things as really just a term for a collection of individuals rather than a concept of the nature of the individual. This quote from Hume illustrates that. He says, "In vain do you pretend to learn the nature of bodies from your past experience. Their secret nature and consequently all their effects and influence may change without any change in their sensible qualities." How is Hume's epistemology problematic for natural theology? I'll look at one example. That's the first way of Thomas Aquinas, and a key premise in this argument is that everything in motion is moved by another. And this depends on two areas of knowledge attacked by Hume. One is causality, that we're able to sense causality, and the other is induction, that from particular experiences the mind is able to drive at a universal knowledge. So we come to an understanding of that everything in motion is moved by another, according to Aquinas, because we sense this happening. He breaks motion down into the concepts of act and potency, and he says that we always see in every motion a progression from potency to act, and that's always generated by an agent that in some sense possesses the act that it's bringing about in the recipient of that motion. One criticism of Hume's account of causation is that he's inconsistent about how much the senses tell us about the external world. He does allow that the senses give us certain things about the external world, such as matter and motion, but he rules out other things, such as causality. So he's not as strict as a philosopher like Immanuel Kant, but from a traditional standpoint, he's overly pessimistic about the senses. And as touched on briefly in the last slide, from a traditional standpoint, in order to perceive emotion, we need to perceive a single subject of that motion, moving from potency to act. So in this sense, motion is a kind of receiving. And so if we can see that, if we can see something undergoing a change, receiving something, then it stands to reason we can also see something bringing about a change or giving something. And that would be the agent or the cause of the motion. So in other words, since Hume allows that we can perceive motion, it seems more consistent to say we can also see the agent of that motion, agency. I'll briefly consider a response to Hume's criticism of induction. One can criticize Hume's nominalism because it fails to explain the reality of concepts which we are clearly aware. So again, nominalism sort of a reductionistic philosophy that basically solves the problem of universals by saying that, well, it's just the way we're using language. But one could argue that we intuitively know that that's not how we use language. We're using language to signify concepts which we're clearly aware, and we're looking for the origin of these concepts. So the early philosophers like Plato were fascinated by the mind's ability to transcend the sense world. And they didn't question that those concepts were very real, and were not just blanket terms. So if we reject nominalism, we need another explanation, and I'll run through this briefly. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but we'll run through the points, and in the sources, there's a very good article on this. So two alternative explanations would include idealism and moderate realism. However, idealism runs into a lot of difficulties with our sense experience of the world. We don't want to reject the sense experience or the experience of the intellect. So moderate realism is arguably a better explanation. It argues that our intellects are able to derive universals from sense experience through induction. And this eliminates the rift between understanding and sensation, as well as between the mind and the external world. So moderate realism is the mean between extremes. These are the sources used in the presentation. I appreciate your time and attention. You can direct any questions or comments to my email address there. And thank you for listening.